Access denied. Access denied.
Where's all this money coming from? How could the UK afford to not increase tax when it was going through a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, mountains of debt, mounting inflation, and being the only G7 country to still not recover from COVID? I mean, all of these proposed cuts would cost over £45 billion. And at the same time, the UK's public services are already at a breaking point. These cuts were designed for people to spend more of their disposable income. However, economists showed that this would be nowhere near enough to compensate for the billions of taxes the government wouldn't be collecting. Instead, the money for the government again came from borrowing. And this is what people had issues with. It wasn't just that it was another gamble at trickle-down economics, it was that the mini-budget wasn't taking into account the effect that so much debt would have on the UK, or what it would have on the already sky-high inflation. So when the new Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng announced these measures, the markets didn't react so kindly. Immediately, investors across the world were skeptical. It wasn't at all proven that this would work, and went against decades of economic planning. And one of the biggest problems investors around the world had with this was due to the investment strategy that pension funds in the UK were using. Now this is going to get complicated, so bear with me here. Pension funds in the UK invest heavily in gilts. Now gilts are a type of government bond that lends the government money with interest. And to protect themselves against the rates on these types of investments falling, these pension funds put up collateral to protect themselves. This means that pension funds have to pay liquid assets, usually cash, to offset their losses. Now usually this isn't a problem. Gilts are generally safe investments and their prices aren't usually volatile, so pension funds rarely have to put up large amounts of collateral at once. But when the mini budget was announced, the price of these gilts sank sharply, and this meant that pension funds had to put up a lot of collateral very quickly.
The Bank of England has said that it will buy as many long-dated government bonds as required between now and October 14. So this is a window as it looks to stabilize financial markets.
They didn't have enough liquid cash, so they had to sell their own gilts to make it up, causing the price to drop further and further. This was the beginning of what is termed a doom cycle, as the more gilts were sold, and even more collateral needed to be put up and on until collapse. Now I know this sounds complicated, but to show how serious this was, top economists predicted these pension funds would have had to have paid as much as £550 billion in collateral if gilt prices continued to fall. And to make clear, if this happened, it would have meant that 50% of private savings would have disappeared like that. So to stop this disastrous cycle, the Bank of England had to immediately step in, and they bought up $65 billion of gilts to stabilize the price and stop this doom cycle. And luckily for the entire United Kingdom, this actually worked. But if it hadn't, the UK economy would have crashed in the same way as many third world economies do. The IMF even told the UK government that they needed to keep inflation in check if they wanted to avoid complete economic collapse. And the markets weren't idle on their fears either. Assuming that it was about to inflate in value, everyone started selling the pound, and as more and more people sold their pounds, its value dropped further and further, and by the end of the day, the pound had hit a record low against the dollar, only being worth $1.03. And this didn't just mean that people's savings were being decimated before their eyes. With the pound dropping like stone in the water, the UK had to borrow billions more, and investors then started to worry that the UK would never be able to pay back its debts. It's now becoming very clear that the UK is in an economic disaster, and the public's reactions to these measures were just as explosive as the markets. People were so outraged that the government had to actually U-turn on their proposed tax cuts for the ultra-rich. This happening just within weeks of Liz Truss becoming Prime Minister. Mohammed Al-Arian, who once ran the world's biggest bond fund and a current advisor to Allianz, said, quote, "The bank's band-aid may stop the bleeding, but the infection and bleeding will get worse if they do not do more." And because of this deepening economic crisis, Andrew Bailey, the governor of the central bank, claimed they will, quote, "not hesitate in increasing rates by as much as needed." Now what this means is that borrowing will be harder and harder for businesses and regular people. This has caused mortgage lenders to withdraw 40% of their available mortgages from the market, which makes buying a home for millennials virtually impossible. And analysts now expect that the Bank of England is going to increase the cost of borrowing to 6% next year. Right now this number is 2.2%. So the Bank of England is going to increase the cost of borrowing by 4%, all to shore up currency and convince the markets that it's committed to getting inflation under control. The consequences of this means that next year, Brits will have to spend 3 to 4 times more to get a mortgage, making home ownership virtually impossible. And as the nation enters this economic collapse, the UK's public services are now under tremendous strain, all while the workforce has demonstrated that they're prepared to strike in large numbers over pay.
A major London tube strike is underway. It'll go on until Tuesday morning local time. The London Underground is advising people not to travel if they can.
One of the only options left to balance the books would be for the government to reduce spending. However, this would also prove to be equally politically challenging, as the country has been in austerity for almost the entire decade. But if the government doesn't do something fast, this problem is only going to get worse. According to Eurasia Analysis, quote, Truss and Quartain are now facing a severe economic crisis as the world's financial markets wait for them to make policy changes that they and the Conservative Party will find unpalatable. But you see, whilst the UK is stuck in the mud, this whole crisis is just part of a much wider